As as time goes on, I find it harder and harder to um, talk in indirect ways, um, and even sometimes find it difficult to use some of the concepts that I know are very powerful. I know are very resonate with seekers, and I know because they resonate, and I say they're powerful because they can shift dynamics quite strongly. But I find I can't deliver it because it's too flowery in a way. It, it's I think there's a simpler way. Now, when I say simpler, simpler, often we think, oh, simple is good. I'm not sure that a simpler way is good. I'm not sure that a simpler way is better. But I find myself unable to deliver the other way. So even saying everything is happening according to God's will, quite a few years ago, I found that I much preferred to talk about life. And so, as some sort of compromise, I started talking about life's will, because hopefully life is less personal, or doesn't get turned into, doesn't get given attributes that we often give God. Attributes, even God within spirituality, God within non-duality, is interchangeable for awareness or consciousness. And so we then say consciousness is creating life, and so we create an idea that there is this consciousness with a cognitive capacity, consciousness, a universal consciousness that has this omnipotence and omnipresence, and is somehow all powerful and all knowing. And I just don't believe in that. I don't. It's not necessary in my system to have that component to explain things. And so today's satsang is going to, in no uncertain terms, break it down to a very practical and materialistic, in a way, explanation. And materialism, I think we have an issue with it because we think, oh, that's how everyone sees life. And so then we hear about a non-materialistic view, and something inside of us says, yes, okay, that must be, or maybe, the saving grace. The saving grace isn't what I have known, and so anything different can be appealing. And I don't think most of humanity sees life in a materialistic way with enough clarity, or seeing the nuances as they relate to the human suffering and potential peace of mind. And so describing things from a materialism point of view is new if it includes components that aren't in the materialism or materialistic view that we grow up with. So, I know there's a place for it. I know there's a place for simplifying and getting us to throw out even the very useful at times spiritual ideas. And having said that, so I know there's a place for describing it in its sort of less flowery, maybe boring way. There is space for that, and there's definitely space for the other, the many others. I started off saying I'm not sure that simpler is better. In fact, I'm sure that simpler isn't better. I'm sure that I hope there is a place for simple, and I know there is a place for all the others. So, this morning I was having a call with someone, and it was a good call because they started off saying, I feel that in my life I get very triggered by people. They sort of somehow a dynamic, a relationship gets set up where people come after me and sort of, in different ways attack verbally and behaviorally. And then the person I was speaking to says, and that really fires me up, and I just want to get revenge. I just want to get back, and I'll spend a large portion of the day thinking about these people and what they said and what they did and how to get back at them and how to try and level the playing field. And I understand that those forms of feeling, those ways of interacting and feeling certain things out of the interaction, whether in this case it was resentment and hatred, anger, blame, feeling diminished, needing apologies, let's say, or wanting to call the person out for what they did and not being able to let it go. It's feeling, it's really personal. Now, that feeling, I think most people could relate to, and if it's not that one, because we're all a little different, but there's some very standard things. There are a lot of other people that will fit into a category of feeling just inadequate in their interactions. And those feelings, whether it's resentment or blame or inadequacy, they're real, they're palpable. And it's not about saying, I'll let it go, or stop, or see life differently. What arises is it's intense. It's like a hypnotism. It's like being hypnotized. And maybe if I describe it for those that have experienced a fear of heights, for example, or a fear of public speaking, or a fear of there are some fears that you just can't go past. They are debilitating. And it might be easy for someone on the outside who's not experiencing it to say, oh, what are you so worried about? You can't fall out of the tree, or you're sitting on the branch, and you might be petrified. Like your body may have frozen up and you can't even turn around to get a foothold to come down. And it's just how it is. So this person I was having the conversation with said, I'd like to be able to respond in those situations forcefully and get my point across, and I'd also like to be able to then let it go, and basically a whole lot of wishful thinking, or saying this is what I would like. It doesn't feel good. This what happens doesn't feel good. So what I would like is all of these much more favorable responses. And the truth is, you can't have that. That is an experience, a feeling that is for a different body-mind organism to have. The body-mind organism that is afraid of heights and is stuck in a tree will say, I don't like this fear. I don't like this debilitation. I want to not be afraid of heights. And you can't have that. Not in that moment anyway. In that moment, there is a structure that is intrinsically in that moment debilitated and forced to experience that uncomfortableness. Now, the person is always changing, so it is the end of suffering, the end of certain psychological movements is possible. It is available in life. But it's going to be one way or the other. And why is this the case? I just want to give one of these materialism points of view. Let's just see life like it presents, as it may well or most probably is. That there are human beings in a world of form, and let's just look at life and say, well, there's a petri dish that started off, let's say, with the Big Bang, and there was all this pressure and heat and some basic elements, and they started mixing, and they turned into something different to what they started off as, and then some life popped up somewhere, very simple life, and on it went, just developing impersonally, turning into from one thing to the next. And humans are a sort of late stage development of this, let's call it evolution. And it's impersonal from this point of view. There was heat and pressure and some basic elements, and then they mixed and they became more complex elements. And then, they joined, and I don't understand it. I just say, why not look at it that way? Because it explains, even if it's not, let's say it's not right. It doesn't matter that it's not right. It allows us to understand what's important to understand. So we look at humans, and we're a work in progress. We are essentially animals, fairly complex compared to the very origins, or what we assume are the origins. But, like a factory that is making machines, there are many different prototypes, and improvements happen. certain functions get dropped off because they don't work very well, and new functions come in, and the software is continually being updated, and errors get fixed, patches, new downloads, all of that. And why not just look at humans as an animal, a biological machine that has its shortcomings, has its glitches. And one big glitch is that we have interpreted life, this life that we're in, through a certain filter. So that filter basically is our brain, our thinking mechanism, which we seem to have a capacity to experience life and think about it and form conclusions. And it's very clear to see that humans suffer. And when we look at what suffering is, it's essentially taking life personally and feeling very inadequate, attacked, unloved in many different forms as we go through life, confused, with expectation and worry, wanting to know what our purpose is. And so it seems like suffering is a normal output of the human being at this point in our development. And so if we look at it like that, then maybe this this movement that says, oh, but I want it to be another way, can start being seen to be, yes, okay, it makes sense, wishful thinking. I would like my experience of life to be better. But what if it's not available given the machinery that we have, the machinery that we are at this point in time? So on one level, we need to look at the human being in a way as being limited or even broken relative to a certain objective. We might say, oh, I want to be able to calculate and remember numbers, and I can't. I don't. I get them wrong. I forget. So we, in an impersonal way, go relative to getting numbers right or remembering, I'm broken. This machine is broken. Now, I'm not suggesting that we use the word I'm broken in a way that says I am inadequate. Because this inadequate requires us to set up a benchmark of how I should be. And I'm suggesting that the human being has limitations. And so when those limitations function, we shouldn't be surprised. What's surprising is our attitude that says, why I don't understand why I am not like X, Y, and Z. So part of the human development is to not understand, as in to find certain things odd, to find things peculiar. Why did that person talk to me like that? Why is this person cruel? Why did someone steal from me? Why are people so interested in themselves or in money or in anything, all the things we don't like, we sort of are perplexed about, instead of working backwards and saying that's, That's how life is. And then finding an answer. And the answer, I'm not suggesting we need to have a complex answer, but it's a really simple answer that sort of says, oh, life is this work in progress. Humans are work in progress, and we have these shortcomings. And so these things happen. Humans are cruel, and humans are very kind and loving as well. And so when we see cruelty, instead of going, I don't understand why, we can look at the human being and say, oh, very complex instrument, functions in many different ways. So reconciling with what is important, but you see, the human being, as I'm describing it, is a complex structure, a complex system that can only do what it can do. And so for us to start seeing that we don't reconcile to the way things are, but rather we try to reconcile to the way we think things should be, we need to be told about this. And then that information starts to bring about change in our structure. Hopefully, change that delivers beneficial difference. Now, the human entity is an entity that has the capacity to think, capacity to learn, to absorb information, and to then think about that information and form conclusions, sometimes wrong conclusions, but sometimes right conclusions. So it has a capacity to think, and its own thinking changes its structure. Its understanding of something changes its structure. So today I came across a question on one of the spiritual seeking groups that said, why, the question was, why are you so interested in enlightenment? And I flicked through some of the comments and I realized that the word enlightenment means many different things to many different people. And there's a lot of fairly elaborate answers that came along with it. Like it's the ultimate. It's it's humanity's calling. So, as many of you know, I think we should define what enlightenment is. Now, I don't know if my definition, Ramesh's definition of enlightenment, is the enlightenment everyone else is seeking out there. But what I do know is that in my experience, I speak from my experience, this is available. This that is the definition. Now, I think it's best to not call it enlightenment, because enlightenment sounds in itself, the word enlightenment conjures up images of non-practical, mystical things. And so the whole point of this talk is, why don't we come to understand the topic without all of the added dimension type stuff, it's not needed. I find it hard to talk about it in that way. I just don't see it like that. So what is enlightenment? To me, enlightenment means the end of suffering, and suffering is a particular human way of feeling. It's a way that a human being turns up and feels is their internal state about being alive in a particular moment. And very often that can be described as being different forms of suffering, different intensities of suffering. And as I said, it's common. It's the natural development, or the standard, the default way that the human organism develops and interprets itself and life, and interprets all of the actions of the others and oneself and the outcomes in life through a certain filter. And it does seem that experience of oneself, how we experience oneself in life, the word that's used often here is an uncomfortableness with oneself. It seems like that can fall away. And so in this teaching, enlightenment means the dissolving of this uncomfortable sense of self, this uncomfortable baggage. We can call it baggage when we see it falls away. Enlightenment is the falling away of that. And what is the falling away of that? It's we would say, okay, you still wake up in the morning, do all of the practical things that you normally do, but without an uncomfortable feeling, without thinking that is inherently within the thinking uncomfortable, and without what some people would prefer to call a feeling of uncomfortableness, instead of just uncomfortableness contained within thought. You can wake up and just feel anxious, feel unmotivated, feel like you wish you would just vanish. So whether we are describing it as a feeling that might, some people would say there's no thought there, it's just a feeling. I suggest that at the base of that feeling there is actually a narrative, but it's hidden. So either the feeling or the thinking can fall away. And that is described as peace of mind. And I, speaking from my experience, is that I know myself as a human being who owns a car and opens the car door and sits in the car seat and drives the car and interacts with people at the shops and people at work and people at home and in personal relationships. And something that used to be there is not there. And unless one remembers the uncomfortableness, then we wouldn't know that anything special is happening. What would be surprising is to hear someone, so if you grew up with the absence of suffering, still as knowing yourself as a human being, but you just didn't feel uncomfortable, didn't have these questions or these doubts, you wouldn't feel like anything special was going on. You might realize something odd is happening if you hear other people's account of how they find themselves in life, how they feel about themselves, what their internal landscape is like. Then you might say, oh, that's odd, I don't feel like that. But until I heard you talking, my assumption is everyone has a human experience free of suffering, which we wouldn't even think of as being free of suffering. We would just think it's normal. And so when suffering falls away, it can seem like a big relief because of the contrast. But once it's becomes stabilized and suffering no longer arises, and suffering basically is something quite simple in one of its forms, is like this just not being able to let go of a conversation that you had at the shops with a stranger who was rude to you, for example. Or not necessarily a conversation, but an interaction with someone. And you just can't let it go. Or a relationship breaks down and there is this sort of debilitating sense that, life isn't worth living anymore because something has changed. And it's the absence of that. It's the absence of that way of feeling. And because it's the absence of something and not the presence of something, we can't really say that it's anything very special, except in contrast to the alternative, which is the presence of uncomfortableness. So it is a possibility, but it's a possibility if the complex organism changes. And one of the things we need to realize is that we aren't in control of changing the complex structure of the human being. What I would say is that if we become interested, if we find ourselves interested, so we can't make ourselves interested, we'll be interested if our structure is a particular way. If we find ourselves interested in this topic and we absorb information and process it, then change happens. Right? And that's not something that you do. It's something that happens. So in today's satsang, hopefully, like I try to point out in most other satsangs, a picture is being painted that says we are a complex entity developed by life, functioning according to our design with shortcomings, with the standard default being a sense of self, a psychological identity that feels very vulnerable in life and feels essentially inadequate and feels like life is not like it should be. So that's what the human being is. So suffering is completely understandable, completely normal. Now, suffering feels very uncomfortable. So saying that it's normal and understandable isn't going to make it comfortable. It is going to be uncomfortable. And then if we see it's the uncomfortableness that just has inside it, it's the unacceptability of it. It is unacceptable because it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. So if there is an uncomfortableness with oneself that is intense enough, it's bound to be unacceptable. As the intensity of the uncomfortableness with oneself diminishes, it becomes more acceptable. It becomes more able to be there, while there is simultaneously a sense of, oh, this isn't so bad. But you can't expect for the suffering to be intense and for us to say, oh, well, this isn't so bad. They're not really compatible. And we can't do anything about it. Now, that sounds like really bad news. However, when we look at the identity that suffers, it's an identity that is convinced it can do something about life and is trying to do something about life. So the very uncomfortableness is based on an identity that feels like and sees itself as something that is responsible for its way of being in life. That's why it might be, ironically, more useful than we think to realize that when suffering is there, uncomfortable as it may be, that there's nothing to do. That it's happening because, because of your 35 or 55 years or 25 years of being in life, your structure, your brain, neurology, your whole biological and psychological structure is a particular way that is making you feel happy, sad, suffering, peace. And if we at least intellectually grasp that and realize suffering is normal, then we may well say, and there's nothing I can do about it. If you notice that when the suffering is intense, there isn't even the space to say, and there is nothing I can do about it. When the suffering is intense, what we see is, how am I going to fix this happening? And that's your hint to at least register, if we can, if it's our destiny. And destiny really means if our body, mind, organism happens to function like that in that moment. So even the word destiny, if I use it, if I say everything happens according to God's will or according to destiny, then we create this idea of destiny created by an all-powerful God. Destiny to me means we are destined to function a particular way, which means life has shaped us as part of this evolution of life a particular way, and we'll function one way or another. So if it's our destiny to realize, oh look, when the suffering is most intense, there isn't space in the feeling to say there's nothing I can do about it. And we'll see how we're trying to do everything to change it. That might allow us to see that the suffering at its root includes the identity that is convinced it is responsible. And so the majority of people in the world, if they listen to what I'm saying, would go, how's that? That's not how you are going to, that's not how anything's going to get better if we say there's nothing I can do about it. And it only makes sense if we look into the dynamic and see that the psychological identity, which is part of the human being, that's part of this imperfect design, this work in progress, that is the human being at this point in time, as we look into it and we see that the psychological identity that feels uncomfortable is at its core the belief in personal doership, which really means I am. It's an identity, a psychological identity, which really, when we look at it, is a belief structure, deeply ingrained belief structure that feels very concrete, because that's what deeply ingrained beliefs, when they're in action, feel like, is a thing. It's an identity that says, I am X, Y, and Z. Really just X and Y in this teaching. I am the one in control of how I function in life, and so I have to be perfect. And I, as the controller, should make my life perfect and make my internal feelings perfect, my external actions perfect. And if I do that, then I can give myself a pat on the back. That's the belief in personal doership. And the other part of the X and Y is the assumption that life will be okay. This feeling of uncomfortableness will go away when I have sorted out life. So we're in the process, because we believe we're the doer and we believe that the solution comes with sorting out life. We're in the process of reinforcing X and Y, reinforcing I am the doer and my happiness will be found, or life will be okay, when I sort life out. So that's our modus operandi in life. And it's that identity that looks at life and says it can't be like that. Why don't we do a better job at life? We need to do a better job at life because my happiness is dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And I look around and life is not pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So we better get to changing it. The good news is that the change that can happen for the human being is a change that allows life to carry on the way it is, which is not perfect, allows the human being to function the way that it functions, which is not perfect, allows the other human beings to function the way they function, which is not perfect, function according to their preferences. The people are going to do what and move towards what they like, and that might not be what you like. So there may be someone getting in the way of what you want to do. There may be the need to reconcile. How come that person likes those things when I don't? So the good news is that life can continue to be the way it is, and our relationship to life, the way we feel about life as it unfolds in each moment. And so when I say the way we feel, it means that there's either that psychological identity that basically feels very uncomfortable in life, very challenged by these circumstances that are not perfect, or that identity starts to diminish, starts to weaken, and what we find ourselves with is the absence of that identity, but still the presence of being a human being. So essentially, a human being free of a certain way of functioning in life. Now, the doership in us will hear what I'm saying and go, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make it happen. That sounds great. It doesn't work like that. Life is throwing stuff down, and it's like it's raining, and we get hit by the drops, and they have an effect, or they don't have they have an effect which might be to change us or not to change us. Maybe that's raindrops, not the greatest of analogies. It's, like, well, anyway, new conditioning coming in from life, and our system is a particular way, and so whether it absorbs the new conditioning, whether it understands the conditioning in the way that the speaker is intending it to be delivered, is not really in our control. It happens one way. We understand it, we don't understand it, we misunderstand it but think we understand it, and it still leads to some positive change. All of that is a mystery to us. What we are aware of is this, oh, I get it. And it seems like I, the doer, got it. Whereas in fact, we were given the information, the brain processed it, and it either got it or it didn't get it. And if it gets it, the thought and the feeling that we have is, oh, that makes sense, I get it. And it feels like I, as a person in control of getting it or not getting it, utilized my power and made it happen in such a way that I got it. That's what it feels like. The truth is, all this stuff came in, the brain did its stuff and popped out an answer that could be, it could easily have been, I've got no idea what you just said. It's just blah, blah, blah. Or it pops out and goes, oh, that's great, I see it, I didn't see it before. And so this notion of non-doership is so absolute. Okay, one of the ways that our brain processes non-doership is it goes, oh yeah, we're not the doers, this is all just happening. And it has no idea really of what that means in its in the deepest sense. In the deepest sense, when we look at it, is we aren't doing anything. As in, there isn't a controlling entity. There is a functioning entity, functioning according to its design, and it is an entity that thinks, but there is no thinker of the thoughts. So what that means is there is an entity that is a machine that processes information and produces thoughts. That's the thinker. But as when a teaching says there is no thinker, what it's talking about is the thinker that we assume to be who I am, that is in control of how the thinking happens. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the system. So when you look for yourself as the thinker, if you really can see, you'll find there's just a programmed instrument. There is no separate, independent thinker in control of the thoughts it thinks. there is a machine that is forced to think a certain way. And it's not just thinking, it's feeling and responding. Every split second in life is the machine functioning according to its, and there's no speaker, there's no thinker, there's no behavior or misbehavior. And it's destiny for us to see that or not see it. And what I mean by see it, clearly I don't mean necessarily just with the eyes. So, someone says, do you see what I'm talking about? So, do you see what I'm talking about? So, it doesn't mean seeing with the eyes. It means I get it. And that happens gradually. It's aided by information. We are information machines, soaking up information. Well, some machines are. Some machines are less interested in information. And we're full of beliefs. The other day, I'll give you, this might be a bit confronting to some of us. The other day, someone wrote earnestly, like it was a genuine question. So this can sound like a criticism. It's not a criticism. I'm trying to make a point. I could tell that they're being earnest. They actually wanted to know the answer to this question. And they said, look, I've come across Ramesh's teaching and your teaching, and I've read some things about reincarnation that Ramesh talks about. Can you explain reincarnation? Because Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says this, which is different from what Ramesh says. And so I could explain reincarnation as it fits into this teaching model. But what struck me more is like, who's Krishna that is telling us what reincarnation is? Krishna's a cartoon character in a comic. Essentially, at some point, our thinking has to go there and get it. Now, that's not to say that the teachings of Krishna, of Jesus, of any of the wisdom teachings, so they are wisdom teachings, that's not to say that they're not extremely useful and profound, but they're not the truth. And at some point we have to go, does Krishna exist? And I don't know, all of the deities in whichever religion, and we might say, wow, I believe in God, and then I don't believe in that God anymore, and I believe in this God. And this is what God has told us in the book, or this book. And Krishna is, for some people, God. Like, shouldn't we look at our beliefs? Because beliefs are a huge part of what holds the psychological identity that suffers in place. We are convinced in a very deep, deep way of our identity, of who we are. And a very significant part of that believed identity is I am the controller of my thoughts and my words and my actions. And what that includes in it, by default, is a separation, is a psychological separation that, because our experience of life is that the experience is that I am a separate entity. Now, that experience of being a separate entity is not the problem. And I'd say, except for peak experiences, or if we get stuck in a witnessing state for some years, hopefully we get kicked out of it, because it's not a great place to live your life from. So, yeah, the sense of separation, the experience of being a separate entity is not the problem. It's you could say part of what causes the problem. We assume that the psychological separation is a feeling, the experience of being separate from the table and from the other people. And so we're convinced that liberation, which is the end of separation as described from a certain perspective, makes us convinced that liberation is about no longer experiencing on an experiential level separation. And that's not where freedom from suffering lies. A oneness experience or witnessing can be part of the dissolving of the psychological separation, because in the same way as the psychological separation got put in place because of experience, the experience of being a separate object in a world, because that's the experience, the psychological identity that matches that experience got put in place. And so some spiritual teaching methodologies are to create, essentially, a dissolving of the experience of separation, induce an experience of oneness, and then have that experience of oneness be part of what allows the dissolving of the psychological identity to happen. Because if we are experiencing experientially the world as interconnected or one, then these beliefs, the psychological identity can't maintain itself indefinitely. And as the psychological identity weakens in that oneness state, the assumption is that the liberation is the oneness experience. And that in order for freedom from suffering to be there needs to be a oneness experience. And what I'm suggesting is that a oneness experience, or having those glimpses, or even being stabilized in it, can be helpful at dissolving the psychological identity that suffers. However, without a oneness experience, if the psychological identity dissolves through some other methodology. The problem is not the experience of separation, but rather the psychological separation that exists, the psychological identity that suffers. That is the problem. So the real solution is the dissolving of the psychological identity that, in my experience, having had oneness experiences and then realizing that that wasn't the problem, was a great relief to come back and be able to experience life as a life of form instead of a life of consciousness. Because in order for the oneness experience of life to be there, the emphasis has to be away from form and onto consciousness. And then at some point we might see, all of life is just experience arising in consciousness. And experience isn't form. Experience can appear as form, or it can be an experience of form. But once it becomes clear it is an experience of form, then we get to see the form in its, what we could say, fundamental essence. And that then starts to be useful at dissolving the psychological identity. But once that psychological identity, you can leave behind seeing life as form life as consciousness and unreal and all that. And in fact, the movement then says, no, you have to live life as if it is real, as if you are the body, and leave the formless behind. So what I've just been talking about is the difference between psychological separation and the experience of oneness, which means no sense of being separate, versus the experience of being separate. And liberation, meaning the end of suffering, is the end of the psychological separation, the end of the psychological me that believes itself to be the independent doer of everything that happens in life and sees everyone else as independent doers. And so what that has done is it creates essentially an imaginary barrier around the human being that says, I am separate and insulated. I am my own entity. I am my own sovereign creation. And so this idea, by default, says, I am not connected to anything bigger. I am not influenced by anything. I am my own being. So can we see that this notion that I am the doer, I am not influenced? Because if I'm influenced, then my actions are not my actions, they're my influenced actions. And if I was connected, then that means I'm not acting independently. So the belief in personal doership, by default, is psychological separation. It is a veil that covers up our connectedness to life. And where is our connectedness to life? On the one hand, our connectedness to life is the very fact that the words coming out of my mouth are a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that came from life. And it's not like, if we look at everything on a form level, the baby is connected to the mother and then the umbilical cord is cut. And then we say, okay, now they're now separate. But if we're less literal, and we realize, oh, my thinking is a result of the fact that I am not separate from life, because I was given information and able to absorb experience and observe things because I'm not separate from life. I'm swimming around in the soup of life. So the goldfish in the goldfish bowl, when we look at it one way, we say, oh, they're separate from the water, and separate from each other, because we have our understanding of the fish as being an independent object. From another perspective, we see that all 5 fish in the bowl and the water and the plants are one complete unit. And the separation is a conceptual separation that we bring in, and we say, oh no, there's 5 fish and 4 plants and a bowl and water. Because language has, and we think in language, and so there's words for fish and 5 fish. There's numbers, not if everything if everything was one, then we can't have numbers, and we have numbers, so it confuses the situation. So conceptually, because on a level there is place to have individual labels for different objects and numbers of objects, and yet it's also one. And that's the paradox, that's the beauty. It isn't one or the other, it's both. It's like an engine. It's like, is there one engine, or is there a lot of parts that make up an engine? Is there an engine without the parts? And it's a bit of you go, oh, it's from one perspective it's an engine, and from another perspective it's lots of parts. And it's both. And we seem to miss the connectedness, which is because the experience that we have is not of connectedness. And so then that informs the psychological me, creates the psychological me. And we don't need an experience of connectedness in a oneness sense to allow us to feel connected. But it can be useful. Anyway, maybe that's enough for now. I insulted Krishna and said that we can look at life materialistically and still, yeah. Well, here we go. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. You didn't insult Krishna, you just clarified that it's really the peace, the presence, that's the most important. Because it says also in the Bible, don't worship idols, and Krishna as an image in our own thinking mind is just an idol. It's not the truth, and the truth is just I am, the peace. But I wanted to say something else. I wanted to say, I really love you, and I'm so grateful for all your blah blah, because it really helps me, and there's something is working in me. Some days, weeks ago, I had a very interesting incident with my landlord, and I got afraid. There was fear involved. Mm-hmm. And then I was asking myself, who is invested in this? I mean, who cares about the fear?
Mm-hmm.
And this was so beautiful because I could see that my sense of me was only based on a fear
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
inside of me. And like a heavy weight dropped off my chest, it felt like a weight that I was carrying my whole life that always made me adjust to situations in a way that betrayed myself. And this was just so beautiful. I mean, I could see the suffering, how it was created. It was just based on a misunderstanding inside of myself. And this was so beautiful. It was just, and it's still here. I mean, the sensations, the excitement is gone, but there's an underlying calmness and feeling of rightness. And it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, wow, that's so nice to hear, because what I do trust is that over time change happens, especially if we're swimming around in the right field or the right sea, the right goldfish bowl. So it's keep up whatever you're doing. You know, the mix of things you're listening to hopefully is part of what is bringing about these shifts. It's very nice to hear.
I'm really doing nothing. I mean, I'm just, I just love you. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Akshay.
Hey, Roger.
Hello.
So let's see. So my question is, coming upon this teaching and other teachings in the past, I've definitely noticed a greater sense of peace in my daily life. However, there's a desire for that peace to deepen further. So I wanted to ask, is that also coming from the sense of doership, because I'm not accepting of the current moment and wanting to become more peaceful? And similarly related to that is often in evenings and weekends when I have a lot of free time, I find myself just wasting that time watching Netflix or doing something to pass the time. And the thought occurred, it might be better to just sit down in that time and, I don't know, focus on the I am or rest in awareness. But then the question came up, well, what if I don't feel like doing that? And how do I know what exactly I should be doing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So the desire for the peace to deepen, well, it is there. So one way we need to look at it is, okay, that shows me that my genes and up-to-date conditioning are such that they are producing that desire. Now the question is the desire suffering or not? And it depends on how far it goes, because to have a desire, so in the Buddhist sense, the word desire specifically means a craving, essentially, where there is a wanting it to the extent that we feel uncomfortable that we don't have it. And that is suffering. It's part of the psychological me that says things will be okay when I have X, Y, and Z. And in this case, it's shifted away from, something, an object or a form of pleasure, and it's just substituted it with the idea of deeper peace. Now, the fact that you might have a desire for deeper peace, if the word desire isn't meaning what it does in Buddhism, or the Buddhism I had come across anyway, it can just mean, I understand that the peace can go deeper, and I will attend to that because I think it's worthwhile. Just like saying, I have a desire to develop a vegetable patch in the garden. So that desire is, it would be nice to have my own vegetables that are organic, for example. There's nothing wrong with that idea, that intention. So let's change the word desire to intention. As long as our attitude towards that whole project is tempered, or let's say the right attitude. And the biggest part of the right attitude in relation to an intention that we have, or a hope, or a desire, if used in the loose term, is for us to understand I'm not in control of the outcome. I might hope for something, and if asked why, I can explain why, and there could be many good reasons why we would like it. So the vegetables, well, they'll be organic, they'll be more affordable, whatever. But let's not then become attached to that outcome because just because there are very many good reasons as to why we want it. So if held in the right line, we can say, yes, peace of mind in daily living is something I'm interested in, but I know that the outcome is not in my control. That way, it's actually a benefit to have the desire for deeper peace. As soon as we become attached or lose ourselves in that outcome, then it turns into suffering. And if that happens, and hopefully it's destiny for that to be seen, and for the nuance that I'm talking about to be recognized, and that might actually change the relationship to the outcome of peace of mind. There was one other thing I was going to add. I've forgotten what I was going to add. So hopefully that clarifies that point. Oh yes, the reason why at the beginning of the talks I often specify these talks are about something very particular. These talks are about happiness for the human being in daily living. Now, what that's done is it's set up it's not the intention is not to set up a goal or an objective that we get attached to, but its intention is to say, look, this is what is available if it's destiny. It's available because we know people in history have experienced it and have spoken about it, have experienced the change, but not everyone in history has had it. So it is, in theory, available. And so defining something is useful in terms of a movement towards it. And even so, let's make sure we don't get attached to the outcome.
Very helpful. I think I can see the distinction you mentioned. Could you also comment on the second part I had about how I use my free time?
Yes.
And whether or not, yeah.
So I think there's a great benefit in this do what you feel like doing, because there is no right or wrong way to live life, right? So if we go back to what I said, I have trouble saying, if we say life is God's will, everything that happens is God's will, the reason that that concept is there is to try and give us a platform to step off or step onto a different platform to the one that we have, or a different platform to the one we're standing on. And the platform we're currently standing on is a platform that says there is a right and a wrong way that life can turn out. And it's my job to control myself so that I live life the right way. Now that might seem noble. The irony of it is that, noble as it might seem, it creates limitation and restriction. It is part of what limits our sense of being free, because we live life through a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and that means that if we happen to be functioning in a particular way that's not in line with our shoulds, we feel guilty. And these shoulds and shouldn'ts are essentially one of the deeply ingrained sets of beliefs that we have. So if there is a realization, who says that I should live life not watching Netflix? Who says that I should be a productive member of society? Who says that I have to be a father or a successful businessman or whatever? It's like my parents say it, or my school teachers say it, or the priests say it, or society says it. Like, how do I know they're right? Who made them God? And God hasn't told me how I have to live life. In fact, if I read in between the lines in a lot of the wisdom teachings that, are said to come from God, I don't say they come from God. In between the lines, God's saying, surrender to God's will. Now, God's will is the opposite of this is how I should live life. Surrendering to God's will means everything that happens in life is God's will. That's in one of the Christian prayers. It's "Thy will be done." And in the Bhagavad Gita, the story of Arjuna and Krishna, the Krishna that is just a cartoon character, it says the same thing in a profound way. Thou art the listener and thou art the speaker. So basically, it's saying everything that is happening according to life. The speaking and the listening is ultimately because of life. Everything is life's will or God's will. So this notion of God is useful up to a point, because it allows agency to be handed over to God. And that means we stop insisting on how life should be. However, we all know that religions give us all the commandments, about how God wants you to act. And if you don't act that way, you're going to get punished. And God definitely tells you not to watch Netflix on Saturday, because that is a punishable offense. If the Ten Commandments were written now, it would tell us that we can't be on Facebook for more than an hour a day. And maybe those shoulds and shouldn'ts are society's way of getting things to turn out a particular way. Maybe that's not really God's will. So essentially what I'm saying is, if you experiment with looking at life as an unfolding according to your structure, and if your structure says, if your structure asks itself, who says I have to be a certain way on the weekend? And if it comes up with a conclusion and it says no one absolute has come down and told me that's how I should be, it's either I've concluded it myself, and so if our thinking structure says, what if I got it wrong? What if my parents got it wrong? Why did I conclude it myself? I concluded it myself because my parents drummed it into me. And there can be an opening up. Now, when we open up to do what we feel like, that means if you watch Netflix and you really enjoy it, and you feel like watching another movie, watch it. If after watching it you feel depleted and you don't have a sense of fulfillment or contentment, that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. And next time, you still do what you feel like, and you might find that you don't feel like watching Netflix. So by doing what you feel like, I think we start to receive new conditioning from life, from these experiences, in such a way that we're able to absorb them and learn really from the experience, instead of continually having the experience tainted by the shoulds and shouldn'ts that come in and sort of disregard what the actual experience feels like, and says, even if it felt great, you shouldn't be doing it. So I would experiment with doing what you feel like and seeing that that doesn't then mean you become completely irresponsible and continue to do pointless things. Rather, you'll say, I'm doing things I enjoy or feel like doing. That's a pretty good way of living life, I think.
Definitely. Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome. Hi, Jeannie. We'll try again, but I think you need to put your volume down or something. Hello. That didn't work so well. We'll go on to the next person, I think. Hi, Rajiv.
Hello, Roger.
Hello.
Every day, new insights come through your talks, and it is really great to listen.
Oh, that's good.
Twice in a week.
You're very welcome.
So, my question was, can you explain the suffering dynamics with the analogy of a catch-22?
Okay. Well, catch-22 is where you can't get out of the situation. Whatever you do, you're going to not get out of the situation. And suffering is like that when the doer is in play. When the doer is trying to solve the situation, it's a catch-22. Because the suffering is there, and then the doer goes in to try and fix the suffering, and it creates more suffering. So whatever it does to try and alleviate the suffering is actually creating more suffering. So and a catch-22 seems to be a unsolvable problem. However, there is a solution to a catch-22, or to some catch-22s, and in this catch-22, in the issue of suffering, the solution is that change happens, and when change happens, suffering falls away. But the change that happens is not the change done by the doer. So until we realize that change is the nature of life, then the doer will assume that the only way things are going to change is if it tries to make them change, which means it needs to be attached to an outcome and then apply itself to the outcome. And that obviously is going to create more suffering. So there's no solution. When there's the realization that the nature of life is change, the doer can surrender, or the doer can be surrendered when this whole dynamic is seen, because we see that whenever the belief in doership that says, I have to fix this problem, I have to bring my suffering that's here in this moment to an end, and if it doesn't come to an end, I then feel frustrated. And we see that's just more suffering. There can be a moment of insight that is not the doer's doing, but rather a getting it on the working mind rather than what we would call the thinking mind, which is the doership and the attachment. And then the suffering comes to an end. So that's my best attempt of describing suffering in relation to Catch-22.
Thank you. Great answer.
Very good. Thank you, Rajiv. Hi, Lucy. You're tried and true, Martin. How are you going today?
Thank you, Roger.
Great.
Thanks for doing these talks. It's just so important, Roger. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really just changed my life completely. I was going to ask you about something today. I was watching a Dharma talk by a Buddhist monk earlier. And I used to love monk talks when I spent quite a lot of time in Thailand. Mm-hmm. But I can see why I moved away from Buddhism, because it's just so much doership. There's just so much to do. Mm-hmm. And he was actually talking about anger. When anger arises, to let the anger express itself is a weakness. Mm-hmm. And I thought, how extraordinary. I don't think I don't know much about Buddhism, but I don't ever remember the Buddha saying that. But perhaps he did at some stage, because it was useful for him to say that to somebody at that time. It doesn't apply everywhere.
That's exactly right.
But the question I was going to ask...
I think what how you've summarized it is spot on, is that I'm sure there is a circumstance where it would be appropriate to say that, and maybe even a whole group of seekers at a certain point, it would be useful for that to be the teaching. And then, as you said, but it's not at all universal. It's not an absolutism.
That it would be a very good teaching if, for example, people were so angered with each other by their behaviours and that they were going to commit sort of acts of huge unkindness It's like go into battle or whatever, which of course is pointless. But what I was going to ask you about, Roger, is and you taught me that a teaching is right in the moment. For that set of circumstances, and to unravel the particular knot that was presenting itself. But so thanks for that. What I was going to ask you, Roger, is you talk about biological reactions in the body, and you said that Ramesh used to say to you, "Ang is just a biological reaction, Roger."
Yeah. Yes.
Don't worry about it. It's because you obviously saw it as, I think you said, as a form of suffering. Getting angry, I guess you saw it as a sign of weakness, of suffering. And Ramesh said, it's just a biological reaction, Roger. Don't worry about it. I think you told me, or told us all.
Well,
what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, go on.
I'm telling you what you said, mate. So the question I was going to ask you about was these biological reactions that I think we can call them instincts. This fight or flight, this fear that we got to run away, or we got to fix this. I mean, I just wonder if you could talk about that a bit, because it just seems to me you say we're just a work in progress. It just seems to me that some of these instincts, these biological reactions that happen, we have no control over them, aren't really that useful in modern living. I just wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah. So what Ramesh, I think you mixed up a little bit the two different stories that he had said, or that I had shared at different times. When it came to the oneness experience, he said that was just an experience. Don't worry about it. It's not enlightenment, essentially, is what he was saying when I was talking about the oneness experience. And then as far as the anger was when I was having problem with the description in the teaching that said anger is a biological reaction. And I say, listen, Ramesh, my experience of anger is that it's not a biological reaction, but rather it's suffering. That's what it feels like to me. It doesn't feel clean, even though painfully clean, which is what Ramesh was saying. He kept insisting, Roger, anger is a biological reaction, not a psychological reaction. That's what he was being insistent on. And what he's when he said anger is a biological reaction, he wasn't talking about any old anger. He was talking about the anger he's talking about, right? So, because we will have our idea, like last time someone got angry, is what they call anger. It's like, okay, I got angry at this, so that's the anger that Ramesh is talking about. That is a biological reaction. And it could well be that the anger that someone has in mind is not the biological reaction that Ramesh is talking about. The anger that someone has in mind when they look at the last time they got angry might actually be a biological reaction plus psychological reaction, right? And in that case, if the anger is a biological reaction and a psychological reaction all wrapped into one, then the anger is not a biological reaction. In that case, the anger is a biological and a psychological reaction. But that's doing the concept a bit of an injustice, because the framework separates, has words, and the framework doesn't use the word anger for psychological reactions. So in the framework, we wouldn't say the anger was partly biological and partly psychological. What we would say is that the anger component is a biological reaction, and the hatred, the blame, is a psychological reaction. Now, because
Yes.
most people, the reaction that comes up is one big combined feeling. And that's where my mistake was, because what I was doing was feeling what I was calling anger. And because it was more than just biological anger, when I felt it, I felt that that is suffering, not anger. Because I was very clear at that point what suffering felt like. And so anger, or what I was calling anger, which wasn't just anger, was sort of the last place that suffering was happening for me. And so when it would happen, I would feel it, and I'd say, that's suffering. And then I'd hear Ramesh saying, anger is a biological reaction. And that's where I had my issue. I kept going, no, but my experience of anger is that it's suffering, not a biological reaction. And it took me a while to realize that when Ramesh was insisting, what he kept insisting, Roger, anger is a biological reaction. He wasn't talking about hatred. He wasn't talking about blame. He was talking about the biological reaction of anger. What I referred to as anger was the combination of the biological reaction and the psychological, blame and hatred. And that changes everything. So sometimes when I have these talk about this topic, some people will write in and say, it's not right to say that all anger is biological. And they've got a point if they're using the word anger loosely. But as it's used in the teaching, anger is a biological reaction, not a psychological reaction. So when we get angry, as used in the teaching, it's a biological reaction. But what often comes along with our biological reactions is this psychological attitude of doership and attachment, which then means there's anger plus blame, anger plus hatred. And if we look at it that way, then it hopefully clears things up. So a lot of the responses that you spoke about in your question probably got labeled biological reactions in the question because the distinction of biological and psychological reaction maybe wasn't so clear. And with this clarity of how something that someone might be calling a biological anger and saying it's a biological reaction, we might see, that's both biological and psychological. And so some of these responses that we have may well be psychological in nature, or at least partially psychological in nature. And that might be why they don't serve particularly well, why they feel uncomfortable, or they are outdated biological reactions that our system hasn't really realized are outdated. Looking over our shoulder, thinking a lion's going to eat us or a tiger's going to eat us, may have been very relevant, and now it's less relevant, and we might not have, our biology might not have got rid of the tendency. That's maybe a better example might be you might have been in a car crash and the body has registered sort of a biological assault, and then we find ourselves uncomfortable in the car, and that may be a result of that. Might be that, so that uncomfortableness might be the body sort of still with a biological fear, and it just hasn't ironed it out yet, and said, just because it happened that one time doesn't mean it's going to happen every time that we're in the car. And that can be, someone would argue that's a psychological reaction. But the attitude to that, if you see yourself being anxious while driving, or not anxious, but just on edge, and you can directly link it back to an accident that you had 6 months ago, and see that the body is on edge in the car, you might say, actually, it makes sense. There was this trauma that happened, and now the body is not at ease in that situation. Now, I don't know if that's beneficial or not beneficial. It might be beneficial, or it might be less optimal to have that uneasiness in the car.
Sense. Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. There's a concept that the body keeps a score. If you've come across that, the body remembers.
Yeah.
And that's why we get the biological reactions. It's the body remembering a previous, probably traumatic event.
So. I mean, it's possible.
Yeah.
It is possible, I think, for that. So hopefully you and people listening can see how easy it is for a biological memory to turn into a psychological uncomfortableness, or for there to be a psychological uncomfortable linked to something that was biological. And also see how even the biological reactions in time or with certain therapies could maybe be removed from the body. But all of these things really are, who knows what's going to be effective. And so at some point we have to surrender and say, okay, this is how the body is reacting in this moment. It may well change if I go to certain therapy or certain even body type therapies to get rid of the trauma in the body. I'll try it, but I know that it may not work. And so if this attitude kicks in that is witnessing both the psychological and the biological reactions happening, then there's a space where we can actually feel that there is some peace, even in the midst of the psychological and the biological reactions.
Hey, Roger, thank you so much. Really nice to hear you talking about these things. It gives a real clarity to it for me. So thank you, Roger.
You're welcome. Thanks, Martin. I think we'll take one more question. I haven't got the name, but it starts with F. Flyvap.
Hello, Roger. Thank you for doing this. I just came across you and your teachings a few days ago. I could go through my whole journey until now, but that would just prove everything that you talk about, that life is unfolding without a doer, and there's this chain of causality that has no beginning, that leads our life in a certain direction. So it's really a blessing that I'm here today. When you were speaking during satsang, one thing that really made a shift for me is that you said something, I'm paraphrasing here, is realization it's your destiny. It either happens or it does not, I guess. But despite anything that you can do. So I really felt like something letting go, kind of giving up a part of the seeking in that moment, and I felt a shift there. So thank you for that.
Great.
Now, that being said, although I intellectually understand there's no doer and there's no free will, it's not my experience. It's not my, I guess you would say, attitudinal frame right now. So insofar as there is something to do, what is your stance on self-inquiry? In the moments where I feel suffering, especially when I feel that I should be doing something or should not be doing something, is there a role in self-inquiry and questioning who it is that is the doer or who it is that is suffering? You don't really speak about this kind of practice, so I'd like you to just speak on that for a second.
Well, yes. When we see that, so what's important is to keep looking, which isn't an instruction to a doer, but rather new conditioning that will become part of your up-to-date conditioning, maybe. And then we just find, I don't even need to say it, actually, we might find ourselves catching the different movements in the body, like, oh, that's anger arising, for example. So the thought might come in after the anger has arisen, and the thought comes in and says, that's anger arising. And then another thought might say, oh, and that's a thought about anger arising. And then another thought might come in and go, oh, and that's a thought about anger arising. And then you might laugh. And then a thought comes up and go, and that's laughter happening. So the more and more that we start to see what previously we assumed was my doing, the more we start to see that these are all things happening. So speaking is happening. Now, in order for us to have that insight, or for us to be able to see those things as, anger arising, or anger happening, speaking happening, hunger happening, is for us to understand in principle that all of these very complex biological and psychological movements, right? I create a distinction between biological and psychological because we're not interested in changing the biological reactions. They are not problematic to the topic we're talking about. The topic we're talking about is peace of mind in daily living. So the biological reactions are not a problem for our peace of mind. What we're interested in is the psychological reactions, because the psychological reactions are essentially suffering, and peace of mind is the dissolving, the falling away of that suffering. So that's why we create a distinction between the psychological reactions and the biological reactions, both of which, both the biological and the psychological, we can say are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. The psychological reactions are specifically based on the up-to-date conditioning that's become deeply ingrained, that at its root essentially says, I am a separate independent entity, the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes where life is perfect and pleasurable, and everyone is nice to me, and I function in the most saintly way. That's essentially our belief about where happiness is to be found, and that it's my responsibility, my job. That's the conditioning that leads to the psychological reactions of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. And all of those, whether they're biological or psychological, are complex movements coming out of a biological robot, the human being, a biological machine. Now, when I call us a biological robot, that's not reductionary. Someone might have an idea of a robot as being, some tin cans and spanners and bolts and stuff. The human being is a very complex biological instrument that has consciousness. And so calling us a biological robot or biological instrument doesn't reduce us down to less than what we are. It doesn't imply that we can't love, we can't have emotions, we can't have empathy. Rather, what it's saying is this complex biological instrument that humans are does have the capacity to think, to conceptualize its own existence, to feel, to have emotions, to love, to have compassion, to be kind, to be cruel. And that's not normally how people think about the word robot. And so hopefully what we're doing is we're opening up the understanding of what a biological robot or biological instrument is, such that the word biological instrument, biological robot, encompasses all of the functioning and attributes that we consider my doing, like thinking, feeling, speaking, acting, dancing, loving, crying. Those are all functions of the biological instrument that has a particular physical structure, like it's the hardware, and that hardware is then conditioned, or a software program is downloaded onto it, and that software program is continually being updated. So the combination of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning dictates the biological instrument in that moment. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning are two factors that were never in our control. So if we come to see what we've always known as who I am, and see, who I am is a complex instrument. And that complex instrument has consciousness functioning through it, and is therefore able to be aware of the world in which it exists. It's also able to be aware of its own existence, and it functions in that world that it's aware of, all according to its design, its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, if that sinks in intellectually, it means as we're speaking, we might watch the speaking happening and overlay onto it this description I've just given that says, the speaking is happening in English because my up-to-date conditioning has always been English. If, on the other hand, I had mixed nationality parents and one spoke to me in Spanish and the other in English, I would have the capacity probably to speak Spanish and English because my up-to-date conditioning included Spanish and English. I wouldn't expect to start speaking Chinese if I've never had Chinese up-to-date conditioning. So once we start understanding the principle, then we see that, I peel an orange a certain way because my dad peels the orange that way. And so when I see myself peeling the orange, I say, that's peeling the orange happening based on the biological instruments, genes, and up-to-date conditioning. So I have to peel the orange that way. And then one day we might realize that's a very slow way of peeling the orange, and we come up with another technique. And then we see, the new technique of peeling the orange is also a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the thought, why do I peel the orange that way just because my dad did it, when it's such a slow way of peeling an orange? And maybe we've bought a specially sharp knife, and now we peel the orange just by shaving the peel off, which wasn't the way we used to do it. And we see that the new way of cutting the orange is my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which means my genes allowed for a seeing of a different way of cutting the orange, plus the circumstance delivering maybe a sharp knife for the first time allowed for that to happen. And what we might have said is my doing, we might say I've stepped out of my conditioning, because I'm not doing it like my dad used to do it. And often we think it's conditioning that is the problem. But if we do it a new way, it's because we are now conditioned differently. So we haven't let go of conditioning, it's just that our conditioning has changed. And that's how we start to have the experiential sense of it, is by really seeing more and more that all of these functions that we are convinced are my doing, especially thinking is groundbreaking. Once we see that the thoughts that I have that feel like my thoughts are actually thoughts arising, and I become aware of them after they happen. So if I ask you, what's your next thought going to be? You don't know until it happens. And so you might say, I don't know, and that's your next thought. And why did you have I don't know as your next thought? Only because I asked you the question. If I didn't ask you the question, you would have thought something else. And so your next thought wasn't in your control, but rather was a consequence to something in the environment that you're in that you weren't in control of. In this case, my question. You weren't in control of my question. My question inspired your next thought. And you became aware of your next thought after it happened. And then, wow, my thinking is happening as a result of my genes, up-to-date conditioning, and the circumstance I find myself in. So we then might say, so who am I? If I'm a biological instrument programmed by life, and the thoughts are happening according to the biological instrument, what this question, who am I, leads to is a refining of our understanding of what is there, what is thinking, and if I am just a biological instrument, in part anyway, we then ask the question, who am I? And if a whole lot of functioning has been reduced down to mechanics, we may come across a part of ourself that seems to stand outside of the realm or dimension of mechanics. We might start to hear about the impersonal sense of I am, or the sense of existence, or the sense of being, or awareness, or consciousness. And in this teaching, it'll say the human being is the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through the body-mind organism as personal consciousness. And so the human being in this description is both the biological and psychological and the consciousness of source. And the teaching says it's so important to rest in your essence, to rest in being, to find this place that witnesses all of the functioning happening. And so we approach it in this teaching based on witnessing all of the movements happening as a happening, and by default that means we become more and more familiar with the mechanical, which then may allow that which is less mechanical, much more subjective, to shine through. Well, it seemed like we lost you there. But nonetheless, that seems like a good time to bring the satsang to a close. I hope I didn't offend too many people in referring to Krishna as a cartoon character. Not taking away from the wisdom of the teachings of any of the religions, but hopefully getting us to really question as to what we believe and why we believe what we believe. So, thank you.